We have some slides which I'm going to run through, and we'll give a highlight of the report. But as Bronwyn said, it has really been a team effort, and there is a huge amount of work in there. So I do encourage you, after the discussion, please do check it out on our website and see the detail for yourselves. So I'm going to start by talking about how we approach this report. So I think those of you who are regular attendees at IFG Whitehall Monitor launches will know that the last few years in government have been fairly eventful, but I think it is fair to say that 2020 was unlike anything else in recent times. The pandemic forced the government to change the way it works in many ways, and it saw the government play a bigger role in everyday life than has been the case probably ever. When we started this work, what we asked ourselves was, how have the events of 2020 changed the government? Principally, of course, we mean the pandemic, but we were also thinking about the preparations for the end of the Brexit transition period and the implications of the election result at the end of 2019 as well. So we divide our findings into two broad categories. Those changes that were a result of the pandemic and which saw the government doing things differently out of necessity. And those changes that the government, particularly Boris Johnson and his close team, have introduced to make changes to how government works because of priorities that they have. These aren't hard and fast categories. There is inevitably some overlap. And then the report finishes, and I'll finish my presentation with a short look ahead to the rest of this year and some of the big challenges on the horizon for the government. So to begin, we talk about some of the impacts of the pandemic. We begin our report looking at the financial implications, and I think it's fair to say that the government spent a lot more money in 2020 than in previous years. The extra spending as a result of the pandemic has topped £200 billion, which has pushed total public spending over £1 trillion for the first time ever in this financial year. And this has pushed the deficit up to its highest level as a proportion of GDP since the Second World War. The government is going to borrow nearly £400 billion this year. Now, that increase is mainly driven by the increase in spending, but the government has also seen a reduction in tax revenue resulting from the reduced economic activity across the country. If we dig down into the detail of that spending a little bit, we've seen the government spending money in new ways. So this chart breaks down some of the ways it spent the money, but there is much more detail in the report. The blue bar shows that there's been a big increase to spending on public services, things like, obviously, particularly the health service, including PP procurement, test and trace, the Nightingale hospitals, and so on. But this also covers things like the extra money for free school meals. Excuse me, sorry about that. The extra money for free school meals, the support for the railways, where there were problems because of reduced passenger numbers, and so on. And it also includes an uplift to the budgets of the devolved administrations in the last year. Now, some of that procurement, we argue in the report, was not done as effectively as possible, given the fact that the government wanted to spend money. They wanted to buy in the goods and services needed during the pandemic, but they were unable, or they chose to go through less competitive routes in order to make that procurement quicker. We think that was understandable at the beginning of the crisis, but we argue in the report that as the pandemic wore on, there should have been changes to processes to improve that procurement. We also see greater support for businesses and households through the pandemic, which are the second two columns on that chart. So we see the CJRS, the big yellow gold block in the middle there, which is the furlough scheme, has topped £50 billion this year. There's also been support for self-employed people and greater welfare payments. And then on the business side, we've seen loans, including the bounce back loan scheme, business rates relief, and various grants. And again, we argue in the report, it makes sense for the government to spend this money, and particularly at the beginning to spend it quickly. But some issues have arisen where we think the money could have been better targeted, or where there could have been better systems built in to prevent fraud, particularly on the bounce back loan scheme. And we think it's an oversight that the government hasn't made those improvements through the pandemic. As well as spending money quickly, one of the things we look at is the way that the government has made decisions, and the fact that it's made decisions often very quickly, or at times quite slowly. This chart shows various policy U-turns that the government has made over the last 12 months or so. Some of those are, we think, understandable, whether a result of changing evidence or greater understanding of the pandemic. For example, the recommendation to wear masks on public transport only came in the spring after sort of enough scientific evidence had accumulated on the benefits of that. But some other U-turns, we argue, are due to undue optimism on the part of ministers. So examples here include where the Education Secretary said that all children would be able to go back to school before the summer last year, which later turned out not to be possible, or indeed more recently, when the Prime Minister told Andrew Marr that it was safe for children to go back to school at the beginning of the year before announcing another lockdown in England. And then there's a third group of U-turns, which are, we think, down to sort of misjudgments, perhaps of the political mood on the part of the government, and often misjudgments of their own backbenchers. So I'm thinking of things here. The free school meals issue is a particularly good example. Obviously, the campaigns led by the footballer Marcus Rashford saw government changing its position on that several times. But also things like the house building formula, which was adapted at the end of last year, and the decision on Huawei and the 5G network were often a result of pressure from conservative backbenchers as much as from the public and from the media. Given all of this, it's no surprise that the civil service continues to grow. Nearly 10,000 officials entered the civil service between December 2019 and September 2020, which is the most recent date for which we have figures. And this continues the trend we've seen since the referendum and means that nearly half of the coalition's cuts to staff numbers have now been reversed. Now, where these civil servants end up has changed as a result of the pandemic. The Department for Health and Social Care, DHSC, has seen an increase of nearly a quarter in staff numbers over that 9-month period between December last year and December 19 and September 2020. The Treasury, similarly, has grown by about a fifth, obviously another department very important in the response to the pandemic. And other departments working on Brexit and the sort of aftermath thereof have also seen increases, with DIT, the Trade Department, and BEIS, the Business Department, also seeing quite significant increases. As well as there being more officials, like many of the rest of us, they've been working from home. And like many of the rest of us, they've seen issues with the technology that they've been using. So at the beginning of the crisis, when around 90% of officials in all departments, apart from DWP, were working from home, there were many issues in terms of getting different bits of software to talk to each other. This chart shows that some departments were using Microsoft Teams, some were using Google Meet, some were using Skype, and the red shows where that departments could not access the other bits of software that were being used by other departments. So one of the first big challenges for the government digital service was to adapt and make sure that all of the bits of software could talk to each other. The result of this was by July, every department could access Microsoft Teams, which is the full green column there, but also that they were able to access more of the other bits of software being used by other departments. There was, however, it seems, a continuing reluctance to use Zoom amongst government departments, which I think is quite interesting. So we've seen changes inside government, but we've also seen a greater demand for information from the outside. Now, the press conferences, of course, a big sign of this. The daily press conferences, as they were in lockdown last year, were a huge sort of part of the day, I think, for many of us. And actually, at their peak in May, they hit 27 million viewers. But there have been other ways that the government has been communicating with people, including through gov.uk. So this chart shows where numbers of hits on gov.uk and specific parts of gov.uk. And here we see how visits to Public Health England website and the Department of Health and Social Care peaked very strongly in the spring ahead of the first lockdown. And then for the department, there was a continuing rise through the autumn and winter of last year and into this year. HMRC, however, saw peaks later on in the year. You can see there it hit nearly 30 million visits in late May, as the first lockdown was sort of coming to an end, and there was more interest in the various economic support schemes for households and businesses. And the visits to HMRC have stayed relatively high and indeed have been some of the highest throughout the back end of last year and again into this year. You can see an increase through January there. So there are one final thing I should say on gov.uk actually is we understand it saw its busiest hour ever on the 4th of January when the Prime Minister made his announcement about the third English lockdown. Now, these are just some of the impacts of the pandemic we look at in the report. But we also look at, as I mentioned, the way that Boris Johnson and his team, his ministers and his advisors, have begun to make changes to how government works. Now, following the election victory, we know that his team had many priorities. They were focusing on getting Brexit done, of course, and we've crossed the year anniversary since we left the EU now. They were talking about levelling up the country, and they were talking about reforming the civil service. On civil service reform, many of the issues that they talk about, things like increasing the skills in the civil service, making it more representative of the country at large, professionalising it, they're often things that and reducing turnover as well. They're often things that we've talked about at the Institute. And of course, Bronwyn mentioned many of these in her annual lecture last week. But actually, we think thus far it's got off to quite a slow start. And the biggest change really has been changes to some of the names at the tops of departments that hasn't seen the more strategic agenda of reform really get going yet. I understand there's some audio issues, so I apologise for that, and we will re-record this presentation. I'm going to keep going for now, but apologies for that. So here we see the names of all the permanent secretaries of central government departments over the last few years. And here in pink and dark blue, we see those who left their roles in 2020. So the 7 in pink left government, and Matthew Rycroft in dark blue there moved from DFID to the Home Office. As well as those in pink, we also saw the departures of the heads of MI5, MI6, the Government Legal Service, and the Cabinet Secretary, so Mark Sedwill. Now, some of these had come to the end of their 5-year terms, and it's just a case of sort of natural turnover. But some, including Sir Philip Rutnam at the Home Office, who resigned just before the lockdown and is pursuing a case of constructive dismissal against the government, and Jonathan Slater at the Department for Education, who was dismissed in the summer of last year following the problems with exam results, left before the end of their term. And this, as well as sort of various briefing in the media, gave the impression that there was quite a political aspect to this agenda of civil service reform, and that there was a bit of a breakdown of relationships between the tops of heads of departments and ministers. And we think that's a real shame because, as I said, the reform agenda is a really important one, and we hope that it can move beyond the kind of personal relationships questions that we saw perhaps in 2020 and really make a sort of an impact in the coming months and years. And we do know that there is appetite amongst both ministers and civil servants for this to continue. So we'll be keeping an eye on that in the coming weeks and months. So as well as changes to the civil service team, we have also seen quite a lot of changes to the ministerial team. It's interesting to note that more ministers have resigned from Boris Johnson's government than from previous prime ministers' governments at the same point. So this chart shows the resignations of ministers under various previous prime ministers. And those of you who are keen IFG watchers will, of course, recognise this as the work of my colleague Gavin Freegard, and it continues even though he's moved on to pastures new. You can see there that Theresa May had a sort of particularly high rate of resignations in the second half of her premiership as the Brexit debates got particularly heated. But actually, if we look at the resignations from the Johnson government, he has seen more resignations in that first 18 months of his premiership than any of those recent prime ministers. Now, some of those were before 2020, they were before the election when he still had a minority government situation, and they include people like Amber Rudd and, of course, his brother, Joe Johnson, now Lord Johnson, who resigned during the prorogation discussion battle at the end of 2019. What's interesting to note about ministerial turnover is actually the cabinet has remained relatively stable in the last 12 months. Sajid Javid obviously famously left the government in February reshuffle, but since then there have been no major changes to the cabinet. Anne-Marie Trevelyan left when DFID was wound down, but she is back in the government. And Alok Sharma is still attending cabinet, although he's no longer business secretary. He's full-time on the COP presidency. So I think this talks to the loyalty that the Prime Minister has both for his ministers and that he expects from his ministers. And we can perhaps get into that in more detail in the discussion. I will finish with a quick look ahead to some of the big issues in the coming 12 months. So I think it's fair to say that the continuing rollout of the vaccine is the priority, and we understand, ministers are confident that they will hit their target of offering a vaccine to the 15 million people in the four most vulnerable groups by mid-February. And then the rollout will continue to the rest of the population after that. I think we're going to see, there's obviously lots of concerns about the various new variants that are circulating. And then there's also going to be questions about the extent to which restrictions on daily life continue as the vaccine rollout continues. We know that, again, there are differing views on Conservative backbenchers, and we'll see how that debate plays out in the party and in Parliament over the coming weeks and months. There are various other issues we can talk about, and I hope we'll get into some of these in the discussion, but just to run through them quickly, some of the things that are likely to be occupying the Prime Minister's time in 2021. Obviously, we have elections planned for the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments, and the SNP are pushing for a second independence referendum, so I think that will be a big deal. The UK is hosting COP26 at the end of the year, and focus on emissions reductions will be a big question. And of course, levelling up and the detail of what that actually means. So I hope we'll get into some of that in discussion. I will finish with a very quick summary of our report, which is that the pandemic has seen the government spend huge amounts of money in new ways. It has forced the government to change how it works. But ministers too have introduced changes to how things work, although it's got off to a slow start. And then we finish by making the point that 2021 is a year of opportunities for the government to make some progress on those priorities that were put on hold at the beginning of last year, but that there are challenges ahead. I'm very much looking forward to discussing this with you all.